Training stalling during your off season can be the death of your progress. There's going to be ways to work around this. And today we're going to be covering what do you need to do when you hit a plateau within your training block during the off season phase. You have plenty of runway to keep adding tissue, and you need to make sure that you get back on track with progressing in the gym. Well, don't worry. In the fourth lecture of Maximizing the All-Season series, we're going to be covering just that today and diving into how to make the most out of your training during the off-season. Now, the biggest problem with training in the off-season often comes from not doing enough of an assessment on an athlete. This would come with doing a full needs analysis of the athlete from the very beginning, which includes movement capacity, where does this athlete need development, what are they not capable of doing, and how do we go about fixing that in order to allow them to get the most out of their training in the all season. Now, assuming we've done all that and we get to this portion of training block in the all season phase and we're starting to see issues with gym performance, what do we need to be able to do? Now, there are going to be some questions that we need to start to ask, and a lot of this is going to hinge on the fact of whether we, in that needs analysis, assessed where that athlete was coming from a training volume and a training quality perspective. But there are 4 questions we need to ask and potentially map out some solutions for in order to make sure that the athlete figures out what the problem is and has a solution for moving forward. Now, the first one's going to be, how many sets was the athlete performing per body part before they came into this new training block with you? There is some evidence from an All-Bay paper that says previous training volumes can influence someone's ability to adapt to stimulus throughout blocks that succeed that training program. So when we look at athletes coming in with high volume sets and low volume sets, this is going to influence where you push their plan or where you start their plan during that next block. And we're going to talk about what that looks like here in a bit with some solutions. But that's a really important question to ask, alongside getting some training videos as we go into question 2. Off the back of how much volume they were performing, we need to understand how frequently they were doing each body part. And the reason this is going to be something that we need to assess is this is going to contribute to the volume metric and start to contribute to question 3, which will tell you, 1, how high was the quality of the work that they were doing. Were they doing all 20 sets for back of the week in one session where they're exhausted through the back 10 sets of the actual stimulus for back, or are they actually splitting that up across multiple sessions? And then secondarily, it would also tell you if someone's experiencing injuries or niggles that's keeping them from training at a high level. Potentially that frequency metric could be contributing to that. And so both 1 and 2 lead into question 3, which is, how high was the quality of the work that they were doing? You can have an athlete that was coming in with extremely high volume sets, doing low quality work and not actually providing much of a stimulus because the quality of that work that they were doing was so low. And so that athlete, the solution for getting them unstuck is just delivering a better stimuli. And then that allows them to progress, and they probably don't need as high training volumes as they were training with during that block. So that's going to be a big one for these athletes upon intake to make sure that you assess. And the final one's going to be, what can they manage schedule-wise? The best training program is not what's perfect on paper, but what an athlete can, 1, adhere to, and 2, progress on. And so there is going to be a schedule portion of this that we need to consider, and we're going to start to dive into some common problems and common solutions that we have in each question. Now, in order to understand this, we need to understand that training exists on a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, we're going to see that when training intensity is really high, intensity referring to, in this setting, proximity to failure, the volume is going to be much lower. And then when we stay away from failure, the further we stay away from failure, in order to create the same stimulus, that volume set is going to need to be much higher, okay? Everybody exists somewhere on this spectrum. The difference is, where on this spectrum do you exist? And this will be where understanding the psychology of the client through these training videos will really help you, because it'll tell you where they exist on the spectrum and start to point you in the direction of where you're even going to begin from how do I get this athlete moving forward. For some athletes, it's going to be the proximity to failure side. For some athletes, it's going to be the quality of the work. We're going to dive into these questions and find out what we need to do. So for question 1 about how many sets per body part were they doing in that last training block, the big problems you see are large changes from the baseline that they were actually performing coming into your coaching. For example, if they had a really large volume set and then you rip them down to like HIIT training, which is like just a couple sets per session, there's a pretty high likelihood that they're not actually going to adapt to the stimulus because they haven't spent enough time improving the quality of the work and the proximity to failure of the work that is needed to actually adapt to that low of a volume set. And so lack of adaptation can start to drive them into the realm of not progressing. The flip side can be true as well. You got an athlete who trains to failure, does a low volume set as a result of that, has high quality sets, but then you throw them on an extremely high volume program. They're probably not going to be able to recover session, and the fatigue that's going to get driven up really fast is going to prevent them from adapting and progressing their physique forward. So that's typically the big problems that we manage for question number one. Obviously, the solution there is just filling that initial needs analysis out and understanding where an athlete from a volume set is coming into your program. Question number two, how frequent were they training their body parts? Now, the two ends of the spectrum are typically too high of frequencies leading to injury profiles, where that reduction in frequency actually allows them to have higher performance because they're not having pain. And then on the too low of frequency side, it's typically too much work is fit into one session. And so that quality really starts to drop on the back end of those sessions, and a frequency increase can and just improve the quality across the board because they're fresher for the sets that they're doing later in the week in the separate session. So frequency is going to be a metric of volume. You could technically call this like 1B, question 1B. But I do separate this out into question 2 because this does lead very heavily into question number 3. For question number 3, we're going to be looking at the quality of the work performed. And this is where we talked about the spectrum. If you have an athlete who's newer to bodybuilding, they don't really know how to train to failure with good form yet, their quality of their stimulus per set is really low because they're still trying to figure out how to make their body move in the right direction, that athlete is probably going to need a little bit more volume in order to create the same stimulus. Now, obviously, like beginners are just going to adapt to training in general. But once we get past that initial beginner stage, the less skilled the athlete is and the less their ability to drive a stimulus is going to be, the more that's going to be required to drive them into adapting. And then the same holds true for extremely skilled athletes. So bodybuilders have been doing this for 10, 15 years. They're extremely strong and they can provide a really high quality stimulus per set. This is probably where your role is going to be keeping them from themselves and doing too much work, and then prioritizing their volume landmarks to the body parts that they need the most rather than just blasting everything equally, because they're probably at a physique development point that needs some specialization rather than just improving the actual quality of the stimulus. And the final one is going to be the schedule question, because this is actually one that can really keep someone from adapting. If you have an unrealistic program written for someone where they can't hit all their sessions per week, this is going to drive stress up for them and they're going to feel like a failure. And as a result, that stimulus cup is going to start to get filled more from the stress of not doing what they're asked. And then they're going to be taking away from their ability to adapt to the training stimuli by driving that fatigue up from a stress component. This can also start to wean into work obligations. This can start to wean into family time, which can then drive stress up as well. So the biggest portion of the needs analysis that I think is really important to get someone moving forward the fastest is understanding what they do from the day to day. If they have 2 hours to do 5 days a week, that's what you're going to have to fit that programming into. And so this could go with length of sessions, how many sessions per week that you do. And this could really start to mold into some awkward or some odd program designs in order to fit what the client is capable of doing. But it's going to be what's best for that client. It's what's going to allow them to fit it into their schedule, manage their stress, and adapt to the stimulus from training. So at the end of the day, when we look at getting an athlete from being stuck in an off-season phase, it's typically the root cause of one of these questions that wasn't managed well from the very forefront. If we can isolate that pain point or that issue and then give them the solution that we just went over here in this video, you're going to look like a genius. And it's not that complicated. All you have to do is make sure their form's good so that the quality of the stimulus per set is high. The training volume is sufficient for driving adaptation, but it's not so high that it's digging a hole that's too deep. They're having to extremely frequently deload and really kind of driving stress up as a result. making sure that they don't struggle with injury profiles from super high frequencies or low quality work because the frequency is too low. And then you just make sure it fits their schedule and you're rolling. So it's not one way to program. It's not one way solution for everyone. It's how do we build the perfect program for you or your athlete?